Good morning, everybody. I see some folks are still logging in. Maybe we'll just give it another minute before we start. I'm Angie Grice from the Resource Conservation District, and I am going to go ahead and pass it over to our Executive Director, Lisa Lurie, to make some opening remarks, and we'll go ahead and get started, and then I'll go through some housekeeping stuff this morning. So welcome. It's a little strange that we can't see you all. Everyone's cameras will be off and everyone will be muted. We're using the webinar feature of Zoom, so this is our first time. So we wanted to get the information out there quickly, so hopefully we get it right. So thanks for being patient with us. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Angie. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Angie mentioned, I'm the Executive Director here with the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County. And before we get started, I first just wanted to acknowledge all those who've been impacted by these fires, whether directly or indirectly. These fires have really touched everyone in our community. And so we really appreciate you all taking the time to be here and learning with us as we begin talking about the post-fire recovery. So today's presentation is hosted by the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, the RCD, as well as the San Mateo RCD and our partners at the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The RCD is a local agency, and we work to bring together people and resources to care for the land, soil, water, wildlife, and other natural resources of our community. Most people are surprised to learn that the RCD has been around Santa Cruz County since 1942. And we receive a limited amount of local tax dollars for basic operations and webinars and other outreach activities like the one today. And we then leverage those funds to bring in additional state, federal, private funds to create programs and serve our community. I just like to acknowledge that as a good example of your tax dollars being put to work. So when it comes to post-fire recovery, the role of the RCD is really to help the community heal by helping heal the land. And we do this through education and outreach like this webinar, as well as through technical assistance, which you'll hear more about. We, along with our partner, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service, we provide confidential site visits at no cost to strictly look at the landowner's needs as it relates to addressing the impacts of fire. So whether that's looking at altered drainage or erosion risks that might affect their properties and the broader watershed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Angie Grice now. And Angie's our communications specialist at the RCD. And she also heads up our rural roads and erosion control program. So she's really part of the team that's here in service to you all in the community in post-fire recovery. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Again, welcome. And I just want to echo Lisa's comments about the fire. I've lived in Santa Cruz most of my life, over 50 years, and a third of it up in the San Lorenzo Valley. So it's just heartbreaking to see what's happening, but hopeful to see the community coming together in the way they are. So just some housekeeping, folks. I can't see people out there, so we don't have a way to raise hands during this webinar, but for folks that are there, they're up in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. There is a view option where you can pick some different views of there's the speaker view, which is probably the one you want to put on. You won't be able to see other folks. If it's in the gallery view, you're probably going to see the four of us panelists here. We have a couple other folks from the RCD here, Matt Abernathy and Rich. And then as far as questions go, the presentation is going to be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. You are welcome to, we're going to try the Q&A feature. You're welcome to type your questions in there. If it's something we can answer as we're going, somebody wants a web link or something, we can type that in. Other than that, we will be kind of gathering all the questions and answering at the end. Try to keep your questions to something fairly broad. There will be an opportunity to email us questions, specific questions about your property. We also will be providing one-on-one site visits for folks that were impacted by the fires. And we'll have a questionnaire. I will also send that out after the meeting that you can fill out that assessment questionnaire, and we will try to hook you up with the right folks on our team to come and do a live site visit for you. And then all the questions we get, if we get a lot of questions and we can't get to them, Over the next couple of days, we will answer those questions and we will post a Q&A on our website, and everybody that has attended that is registered that we have an email for, we will send an email link out to you. So I hope that's clear. If the Q&A isn't working for folks, you can go ahead and use the chat. It will go to all the panelists, and we will again gather those up. And at the end, we'll go ahead and go through the questions and try to group some together that are similar. This is our first time using this webinar thing, so I hope we get it right. The other thing is the webinar will be recorded and made available online, and we will send that out, post it. If you miss some of it, you'll be able to see it again or send it to your friends if it was helpful. And then we do have 3 other webinars. You'll find those online. One's about tree mortality and forest health, more in-depth erosion control and rural roads, and then one on stream impacts after fire. If your login will work for all 3 of those, but we ask if you can to register for each one individually. We have a limit to the number of people that can come in, so we want to make sure everyone is able to get in. But if you don't get to it and you at the last minute want to log in, your current Zoom login will get you into that. So I think that's it for now. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speaker, Rich Cassell, and I'll let him introduce himself. Here you go, Rich.
Okay. Thank you, everybody for joining this webinar this morning. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and for being your speaker. For those of you that have suffered a loss as a result of any wildfire, whether it was in Santa Cruz County or someplace else in the state, I'm deeply sorry for your loss, and I'm hoping that my presentation this morning will be helpful to you as you plan your property and land recovery effort. As Angie said, my name is Rich Cassell. I'm a certified professional erosion and sediment control specialist and have been for nearly 40 years. I'm also a post-fire and storm restoration specialist as well, having worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service now for over 45 years, assisting folks following natural disasters, and also for folks that just have concerns about erosion issues and land and water management issues on the properties under their stewardship. Working with everyone from private homeowners to large ranches and everything in between. I have worked on many fires throughout my career, more recently in all the major fires in California. So NRCS in the last couple of years has used me to be detailed to the wine country or Santa Barbara. And now with all the fires going on in Northern California, the Bay Area and the Central Coast, I'll also be assisting with site visits and training personnel and writing publications and handouts and stuff, much of which I have already done, and many of those publications are on the Natural Resources Conservation website, which will be the link will be at the end of my my show here. So as Angie said, we'll save the questions till the end, but if you have something that's very specific, you see my email address is here. It'll be at the end as well. Feel free to send me an email as well, and we can talk about specific things. Hopefully, again, this presentation will be helpful to you as you plan your recovery efforts. So the title is Post-Fire Registration, What Works and What's a Waste of Time?
Hey, Rich, really
Yes.
quick, can you tilt your camera up a little bit? Because we can only see the lower. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. I move around a lot, so forgive me. And I'm not always looking at my picture to know where I am, but at any rate, a little overview of the presentation so you know what's coming. This helpful so that, if you do have questions, they may be answered later in my show. So anyway, safety hazards. So we'll start off with safety first, the role of nature in wildfire recovery. We'll talk about some post-fire restoration strategies and practices. We'll talk about doing a post-fire site assessment prior to coming up with those strategies and practices. I'll spend a little bit time talking about practices that may in fact be a waste of your time. And that may be the most important part of the show for some of you. And then at the end, my summary top 10 list, just to recap the presentation. So safety first. There's some potential safety hazards on site that be aware of. There are also issues that we assess in a property evaluation as well. So fire damaged trees and how damaged they are and whether or not they present a hazard to human life, or buildings that have not burned, or other property improvements, or streams or watercourses or bridges or important accesses to property. There may be an opportunity where some trees could be cut down or severely pruned back. But for right now, we're just trying to reserve the cutting of trees to only the things that are absolutely necessary. There's no need for cutting a massive amount of trees. Toxic ash and debris, it's very important. I know we all have masks anyway these days of COVID and all that, but debris sites in particular, it's important to have an N95 mask if you're kicking around ash and you're in debris. Those for working around it, or those homeowners that are trying to assess, their loss and what have you. This is very toxic material, and the fires burn extremely hot in and around structures, in upwards of 4 or 5 times as hot as the open landscape. So just keep that in mind. There is potentially unstable slopes, the potential for debris flows, particularly in mountainous areas where we have potentially unstable soils and geology. So learn what we can learn in advance of where properties are located will help us, with those issues and help advise you appropriately. Rockfall can be an issue following fire. A lot of rocks are perched on hillsides or behind trees and the vegetation that are now free to fall and to come down slopes. Many of them could have been fractured as well. So what was a big boulder before may be fractured into many, many pieces. Sinkholes from burned root systems, underground culverts and drains that have burnt out, stumps that have burnt out, old septic tanks, old even swimming pools. I was on a site where a swimming pool was completely covered with debris and you didn't even know it was covered. So it can be very dangerous walking around sites if you're not familiar with them. Even if you are familiar with them, things look different after everything's gone. So be very careful. Utility hazards may still be present, particularly soon after the fire. And road washouts, burnt out culverts. A lot of culverts are plastic. They may look like they're all in one piece, but many of them have been vaporized in the fire. You almost have to get down on your hands and knees and touch them, because in many cases, all you're seeing is the outline or the remains of a culvert, but it's actually not there. So especially first times back into properties, this may be where a road may collapse with a car or vehicle going over a burnt out culvert. There could be displaced wildlife. I've seen rattlesnakes in my visits and scared wildlife assessing sites, so be aware of that. And then as we get into the rainy season, the likelihood of flooding and stream bank erosion is higher, even downstream outside of the fire area. So those are some potential safety hazards, just to give you a heads up. Before deciding what to do, if anything, I think there's some overarching concepts that you should keep in the back of your mind before you jump out of the gate and throw everything but the kitchen sink at your landscape. First and foremost is to consider nature as your first and your best post-fire restoration practice. In this case, doing nothing might be the best thing you can do on your property. the very least, less may be more rather than more being more. And we'll talk more about this concept as I go through, but in the back of your mind, right out of the gate, remember, nature's trying to recover, and we're going to try and work with nature. We're going to try to help nature along rather than be sideways with nature. So we'll talk again more about this as we go through the slideshow. Understanding the natural processes that are in place and the role that they play in wildlife recovery is extremely important. And it helps us really decide on what to do on anyone's given property, because everybody's property is site specific and one size does not fit all. So we want to know what we have, we want to work with nature, and we want to tread lightly so that we don't get in nature's way and we can expedite the recovery. To give you an example, this photo here is from the wine country fires I took in 2017 on a large livestock ranch. And only 6 weeks prior to me taking this picture, this scene was completely black. As you can see, some of the trees only suffered heat and smoke damage. 95% of them will all recover. And as you can see, just only 2 weeks following the first rain, how much grass has already returned to the landscape. So understanding natural processes and the role of nature in wildlife recovery, on the onset or outset, fire is natural in the landscape. So respecting that landscapes have adapted to fire for thousands of years. Soil erosion is also natural and a landforming process. And as a soil erosion control specialist, I, for one, will tell you that we're not going to be able to stop all erosion following fire. It's going on all the time, and it would have been going on even without the fire. With a keen eye, I can, and I'm in the business, I can see erosion. I can see evidence of erosion on most any landscape. But after fire, it's accelerated. The opportunity for more soil erosion to occur is greater. So we're trying to minimize that. There's no way that we're going to stop all of it, but we need to recognize its place in the landscape and to try to minimize its effect, particularly on property improvements and on waterways and on other natural resources. Many plants are actually dependent on fire to regenerate. And so particularly some of our tree and shrub species will release seed and will be actually stimulated by fire. So knowing that, again, by overseeding or doing too much revegetation or too much land disturbance to try and help nature, put the plants back, we might actually be slowing that process down. Keep in mind the regeneration of vegetation whenever we have that opportunity. It's much better than starting a plant off from seed, especially going into the winter. Recognizing that a lot of these plants still have very viable root systems, particularly on slopes. Other things to consider in terms of understanding these natural processes following fire. A lot of trees and plants that typically are not deciduous, all of a sudden are deciduous after a fire because of heat and smoke damage. You may have not seen it quite yet, but as we get into winter and into the fall and any wind that occurs, we're going to see a tremendous amount of leaf drop on the landscape, especially in the more forested areas. But saying that, keep in mind that this is one of nature's natural defense mechanisms and restoration effects following fire. The leaf drop will add and be a mulch on the ground and protect that bare soil from just the direct impact of raindrops. A raindrop will hit the surface of the soil, bare soil, at about 30+ miles per hour, and can displace soil particles 5 feet in any given direction. So the starting of erosion actually starts with that raindrop. So if that raindrop hits a leaf, a burnt branch, a stone or stick sitting on the surface, it's starting to take some of that erosive force and helping to minimize erosion as soon as that raindrop hits the ground. Ash has a role early on. It's very absorbent, and it also will form up a crust if the rains are light in the beginning. But if there are plans or recommendations to do any seeding, then ash on the slope will need to be raked before any seeding is done. We'll talk about seeding a little bit later, but there is a role for ash early on, and as well as burnt plants. People are very anxious to start cutting their burnt plants out of the landscape. There is a role or time to do that, but keep in mind there's actually disturbance that you're making to soils and slopes when you're up there, cutting plants out, even if you're just pruning and even if you're trying to be safe. There's resident seed bank in the soil that can be disturbed from any ground disturbance. And those burnt plants, again, are helping to provide still some canopy over the bare soil. Saying that, I realized that some folks had a fire that burned extremely hot anywhere around a home that burnt down, a lot of white ash, burnt very hot, burned surface root systems, burned or compromised, resident seed bank. And so those areas are where we're going to probably concentrate our erosion and sediment control efforts, but probably not out on the open landscape as much, like in the picture in this background. So there may also be a lot of fire-related debris in our streams and waterways following fire. We need to be careful about not removing this material too quickly. You should have that streams assessed if you're concerned about debris jams or log jams or that sort of thing before removing debris. These debris jams can actually be beneficial in streams depending on where they form, but obviously there's areas where they are not going to be beneficial, particularly if they're behind a road crossing or next to a major access bridge or such things as that. So some other things to keep in mind in understanding the natural processes in the role is working with the natural sheet flow of runoff. It seems like right out of the gate, most of us think that we need to control runoff and that we're doing something good by doing that, by diverting it. Even by putting a water bar in a fire break is a form of diversion and channeling of runoff. When we do that, we concentrate flow, we can increase velocity, and if we're not careful, wherever that water ends, it can cause greater damages than what we're trying to prevent. So nature, when water flows naturally over the landscape, there's going to be less issues. Remember, when you control runoff, you control nature. And that doesn't always end well, particularly after fire, because drainage systems are all undersized after fire. Even if they were sized appropriately before fire, your road culverts, your drains, everything is going to be impacted following fire. We'll talk about drainage in a second and more about runoff control. And then the role of just the basic erosion control factors. These are the main factors that influence erosion and how bad erosion will be depending on these factors. And it's the amount and type of vegetative cover and the degree of damage to that vegetative cover. So that's something that we assess on every property. And all vegetation wasn't created equal. Some is deep-rooted, some is shallow-rooted, some is perennial, some is annual, so some is native, non-native, some is invasive. So every plant has something that it either offers or is a detriment to the landscape following fire. Soil type, whether it's sandy, clayey, loamy, what damage the fire has done to it, whether it has been affected by the fire in a negative way. We look at how soil might influence erosion on a property, the steepness and the length of slope. So not just how steep it is, but how long the slope is will determine the amount of water that would accumulate on that slope and how fast that water would speed or come down that slope. And these are factors that will influence the amount and the severity of erosion. So the topography of the slope and the length of it and steepness is really important. And then rainfall amount, but as important, probably more important, is the intensity of that rainfall. How much rain falls in a short amount of time can be very devastating following fire. For example, in the 2018 Montecito debris flow, a half an inch of rain fell in 5 minutes. And this was on January 9th, and there hadn't been any rain for almost 2 weeks. In fact, the fire was still burning, and we had a massive, debris flow in Montecito that killed 22 people. And last but not least is the human impact. We have to add that as one of the potential erosion factors, including how we deal with fire following, what we do on the landscape following fire, such as, some of the practices that we may put on the landscape following fire. And we'll talk more about that as we go along here. So some of the wildlife impacts, wildlife is going to affect soil health, fertility, productivity, biological activity in the soil. It's going to affect erosion hazard, slope stability, runoff, air quality, water quality, plant communities, fish and wildlife, and people's homes, people's businesses, their lives, their agricultural land, agricultural production. All these things are impacted by wildfire. And we need to consider all of these things and be careful not to just treat one natural resource at the expense of compromising another or causing a new problem. As an erosion control specialist and as a natural resource management specialist, I like to look at the big picture. I look at how everything works together and respecting how everything works together in the solutions we come up with on an individual property. Because every single property has its own set of variables to consider before throwing stuff out over the landscape. So high intensity fires can burn hotter and destroy complete plants, complete roots, and resident seed bank. The picture in the background is from the Atlas Peak fire in Napa County in 2017. This is where the fire burnt very hot, killing root systems, compromising seed bank, almost completely destroying it. As you can see, most of the trees are completely beyond regeneration. You can also see dry ravel on the slope where you just basically have dry erosion taking place. Just the fact that we have steep slopes and erosive soils, even without rain, the soil is sliding down the slopes along with rocks and parts of vegetation and what have you. Saying all this, low intensity fires typically burn cooler, but they can smolder and they can still have a severe impact on the soil as well. So first and foremost, it's always, for me, always a good idea to get a good assessment of the property, determining the degree by assessing all these items with a walkthrough on a property. When I meet with a landowner, a property owner, the first thing they want to know is, should I put straw wattles? Should I seed? Right out of the gate, they want to know what practices they should do. And I like to hold off and see what we have first before, I start throwing out a bunch of potential practices that may or may not be applicable to that particular site. But getting an idea of the site history from the landowner is important. If the landowner can provide me any fire history, how long ago had the property been burned, if they know. If not, we may know from large fires that have occurred in the last century when it may have burned last. But that's really important to know because it helps us know how hot the fire may have burned on the property. If that property owner had done a really good job with pre-fire, work and having a fire-safe landscape, then we know the fire may not have burned as hot as it may have burned if you didn't have you hadn't done that work to have a fire-safe landscape prior to the fire. Even if you've lost your home, if you did the homework, more of the landscape may regenerate, whereas a hotter fire, less may, regenerate. So fire intensity is, really how hot the fire burned, and the severity is how much damage really the fire did to the property as a result. So looking at the degree of damage from the firefighting effort. Now, some people had no firefighting effort on their property, but this is one place I like to concentrate some of my efforts is on the site and get that evaluated as soon as possible, particularly if there's fire breaks or dozer work that was done on, even hand trails, even things that were done by the property owner. This is where we have disturbance to the soils, potentially disturbance to the slope, obviously disturbance to seed bank and plant root systems and stuff. So this is where we're more apt to get more serious erosion than out on the open burned landscape, is where we have churned up and disturbed soil. The presence of white ash, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be areas where we have more damage to root system and resident seed bank. And then, assessing the degree of tree and plant loss, assessing the infrastructure damage, damage to access routes and driveways, because we want to ensure that there are always safe access, particularly early on, because we're not quite sure of what damage may have been done to the roads and driveways and infrastructure surrounding the drainage systems and or the drainage systems around a home site. If there were roof runoff systems or drainage ditches, or where does all that water go now? So we'll look at drainage is really important. And then just the impact that of the fire on the soil and the surrounding slopes on and around burnt structures. So some of the post-fire restoration strategies, I like to call them strategies rather than practices, but you can call them either, but it's what to do, if anything, and like I said, maybe what not to do. My first order of business when I visit landowners on site is helping them not be their own worst enemy. In many cases, what we're looking at is, in my eyes, is worse than what's actually there, and trying to find all the good in what's left and working with that and bringing the landowner up to that understanding. So whatever we do put on the landscape, that landowner has the knowledge and the understanding that that practice is going to need some level of maintenance throughout the winter. So again, using nature as the best management practice is first. Second, because everyone wants to do this, it seems like first, no matter what, is no widespread seeding is really needed, particularly out on the open landscape and on massive amounts of acreage. There is some exception on range and pasture lands. There may have opportunity to improve range and pasture lands if they were very weedy before the fires, but for the most part, most of the seeding would be reserved to the really high disturbed areas, maybe along some important waterways, along driveway accesses and around home sites. And that seeding will be very site specific to the watershed, the region, the area, the property exists in. We try to match a seeding and a seeding recommendation to the soil, to the microclimate. There would either be a native seeding or a native seeding with a nurse crop of a sterile annual fast-growing grass that won't compete terribly with the natives. But most of the native plants are going to help us towards the end of the rainy season, and more importantly, the second season following, a fire. I always tell people to be prepared for at least 2 winters after fire, not just 1 winter, because nature's resilient, but it's going to take more than just 1 rainfall or 1 winter to bring her back, to where she was before the fire. And then mulching. And again, mulching might be natural mulching. It might be leaf drop. It might be gravel and stone that's already on the landscape or plant parts. But other mulching might include wood chips or straw, hydromulching in some cases, very site specific. Compost might be something as well. But what does mulching do? It reduces the raindrop impact, as I mentioned earlier, reduces erosion, it can trap sediment, it slows runoff. So if it slows runoff, it slows the speed of the water down, the erosive effect of the water. It can add organic matter to the soil, and it helps to retain moisture for plants, both if you're seeding, but also for the resident seed that's in the ground. It helps with regeneration. Note that some weed seed may be in straw, and it may even be in rice straw. Rice straw is one type of straw that we recommend because there's very little weed seed, if any, in rice straw, depending on, how that rice straw was transported to the site, where it came from. There's always an opportunity for it to be contaminated somewhere along the way. And then there's sterile wheat and barley straw, but it can have weed seed in it. And so depending on where it comes from, you might have to watch out for some weed regrowth following any place you were to use straw. But you need to wait with the straw before the first rains. Most of the fires I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years have all occurred in the mid to late fall. And so we were at a time where we didn't have much time before the first rain, so the straw went out immediately. But for summer fires, we don't want to create a fire hazard by spreading straw all over the place. For one thing, the ground may still be hot. The straw might ignite just from hot soil. CAL FIRE tells us if the soil is 100 degrees or more, it could in fact reignite, any dry material that's on the ground. So it can be a fire hazard, and I just throw that out there because straw is one of the most popular post-fire restoration practices, one of the best, cheapest, and easiest things to accomplish. A lot of people want to use wood chips. I developed a handout on wood chips and straw mulch, pros and cons. And so it's something worthy to beef up on. You want to keep things fairly shallow because these things can be, like I said, fire hazards, but they can also, curtail regeneration and plant growth if they're on too thick, because people use these things even when we don't have fire to what? Control weeds, right? And to beautify their landscapes. So in an erosion control situation, less is more. So fiber rolls and straw wattles, people would be really quick to throw these out all over the place. Keep in mind, most of the time they're installed incorrectly and improperly placed or located on the landscape. In some cases, they may even be doing more harm than good or not doing anything at all. In particular, this picture on the screen here, this gentleman spent $5,000, gave $5,000 to a contract to put these 4 rolls out on his unburnt lawn. And he was thrilled that he was able to get this work done, prior to the first rain. But proper location installation is critical, and there are a lot of people that want to take your money after fire. I hate to say it, but there are lots of opportunists out there, and they're very well intended, some of them, but some of them are not erosion control specialists. Some will call themselves erosion control contractors. I've spoken to many of them, and they've been doing the wrong thing for 20 years. So, so if I can armor folks with the right information, if you're working with contractors, then you'll know what's right and what's wrong. But these straw wattles or fiber rolls, they can help slow runoff, control erosion and sediment. As I mentioned earlier, we want to minimize that tree cutting and plant removal. I would wait until next spring, early summer, before we get into any removal of dead trees, unless, of course, they're creating a hazard to life and high value property. But minimize that cutting and plant removal as much as you can. And you get a site assessment up front, that will help. You can also consult with a certified arborist or a registered professional forester. So around home sites, containing toxic debris and sediment is sometimes the first order of business. Sediment and debris removal through the FEMA program in some cases is very quick. In other cases, people are waiting several months into the winter, and a lot of the material from their home site may mobilize into nearby waterways and pollute soil and just be a mess. So we can help with some ideas on how to stabilize some of this debris before your debris clearance takes place. And we can also talk about providing some soil and slope protection around homes and access roads at the same time, if necessary. It just depends on the site. So drainage issues, everything is undersized after fire, but these are all things that may be necessary. Again, it's a site-specific call, but you may need to repair or enlarge existing systems. You may need to create backup systems. You may need to install new systems. You may need to eliminate existing systems that are now either high and dry or no longer have an adequate outlet or totally impacted. So we'll look at the drainage systems. It's one of the first things that I like to walk through any site to look at whatever exists. And again, be very careful about creating new ones that will possibly cause new problems. Repairing damage from the firefighting effort, fire breaks and dozer areas that were created by contractors, fire agencies, landowners. I can't tell you how many fire breaks or how many water bars I've told people to take out that were done by others or even themselves because they were actually creating more of a problem. A lot of our fire breaks are on the ridges. They're only going to have to deal with the water that's actually falling on them. It's generally not that big of an issue. If you were going to spend time on a fire break, it would be spreading the soil out back so that water flows naturally, sheet flow, as I mentioned earlier, rather than concentrating it in water breaks. So be careful what you wish for when you think this is a good thing on all your dozer trails and fire breaks. There's other things that you can do and other things that CAL FIRE has done and fire agency have done, such as lop and scatter, such as treating fire breaks in dozer areas by spreading uncut brush that had to be pulled down as a result of making the fire break and spreading that over the surface no more than knee height is really important. You don't necessarily have to put and lay stuff across the slope. You don't want to give the water or runoff an opportunity to hug something and concentrate. So the more scattered it is, the better. That's why it's called lop and scatter. Seeding and revegetation fall very site specific. And we want to make sure for those in Santa Cruz County, do not use the Santa Cruz County erosion control mix for post-fire, even though in 1982 it was developed following the storm disasters for part of this reason. But there's many plants in there that can be very invasive for the post-fire landscape and compete with natural regeneration of native plants. So let's wait on nature. This picture in the background, that's what we're doing. This is in the Thomas Fire in Southern California. Lots of natives, forbs, wildflowers come up. Some plants have been waiting to come up for decades. That seed has been dormant and sitting there. And this is part of natural succession. This is part of nature going through the process of healing herself. So there's sometimes, recognizing that we can be ahead of the curve. And there are things that we can do on the landscape that can speed that process up with nature. But again, without going into a lot of detail, because this is a very controversial subject, very complex, I could put a whole workshop on just this subject alone. But this is really the most take-home message that I can tell you. We are working with seed companies in Santa Cruz County to come up with a seed mix for around homes and roadways. So stay tuned. So controlling invasive plants is going to be important because especially when those populations are small, they may be the first things that come in following fire, depending on what was there before and what was on the surrounding landscape. So part of our site assessment, we look beyond the fence lines. You need to do that yourself when you go back to your properties or you do your own property assessment. Look at what's going on neighboring properties, particularly if you can remember what was there before, if there's nothing to look at this point. Because if there were a lot of invasives, you can believe they're going to be on your property as well. They're going to be coming back gangbusters. What's wrong with this, even though they provide root structure and protection to the soil, is that they will compete with the native regeneration and delay natural recovery, and it will affect the whole ecosystem in time. So it's a time that we can have a better opportunity to get rid of these things when the populations are small. Monitoring maintenance is going to be essential for all practices, and it's going to be needed throughout the winter, not just once, at the beginning or before next year, throughout the rainy season on all the practices, pre-existing, new ones, and just keeping an eye on how well nature is restoring herself, and then to repair and address those defects as soon as possible. Practices that may be a waste of time. I already mentioned straw wattles. I mentioned a little bit about hydromulching, very site specific. I've already mentioned seeding. Hydromulching is a slurry of material that gets spread out over really super steep slopes that are within 300 feet of an access point. It's kind of a down and dirty, quick way of providing some soil protection, and sometimes it's included with seeding, but not always. But not always, the gold-plated solution either. Even though people think once it gets hydromulched, I don't have to worry anymore. Not so much. Plastic sheeting, a lot of times that's the first thing out of the bag. I see it all the time after fire. You can see it in this show here in the background. Almost always the wrong thing to do, 99% of the time. Could do a whole slideshow just on all the reasons why you would not to use plastic sheeting. Sandbags, there's a right and a wrong way with sandbags. Certainly on this situation, holding jute netting down with sandbags, maybe as a secondary, but generally you want to have enough and the right staples. If we're recommending erosion control blankets or jute netting. This picture is showing nothing right, by the way. The straw wattles are incorrect. They're not dug into the soil. They're on top of the jute netting. There's nothing underneath the jute netting. You can see how it's loppy, it's tented over the surface, over cut vegetation. Back here in the background, you can see the land didn't even need anything, to be honest with you. Most of this ground was going to come back naturally by itself, and the landowner decided to spend $20,000 and gave that to this contractor, this is about it. You're not seeing much more outside of this picture. That's a lot of money, and it was a waste of time, and probably, is going to basically curtail the recovery. So I'm not saying there's not a place for it, but this is a practice that's more often installed improperly and not even needed than almost anything else. That and plastic sheeting and some of these things I've mentioned here. But, and here, emergency practice, the same thing, very strong caution not to use them, but if you use them with extreme caution, knowing that, that they have a high maintenance. They often provide a false sense of security, and most of them are installed improperly only to give the landowner a greater sense of false security because, again, everything wrong here in this picture, plastic at the top of the slope, 1,500 square feet of plastic generates 1,000 gallons of water with 1 inch of rain. All of that water comes off the plastic and it ends up 9 times out of 10 on bare, fire-disturbed soils and can cause horrendous erosion just from that. It also kills everything underneath it and doesn't allow for any regeneration of plant roots or seed bank. So and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I could go on and on with plastic. There are very site-specific selective times when you could possibly use it, but you always want to cover soil that's dry, not wet with plastic. And if you're going to use it, it should be dry. And you should have the opportunity to remove it between dry spells in the wintertime. So that's something about emergency practices very quickly. We're getting to the end here. I want some time for some questions. So in a recap, my top 10 list includes what landowners should consider if fire has caused damage to their property. Number 10 is to get help from licensed and certified experts and advisors to use the services of the Natural Resources Conservation District and the Resource Conservation Districts. They're non-regulatory agencies. Their services are free. They don't sell anything. They don't do the work. There's no vested interest, and they're completely confidential. So I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to use them. I know some people are scared. Anything that's quasi-government, stay off my property. But this is one exception. Respect the laws of nature. Remember, when you control water, you control nature. And that one size doesn't fit all. Every single property is unique with a unique set of variables to consider before, putting any post-fire practice on the landscape. You want to minimize your soil and slope disturbances, and those soil and slope disturbances most likely would be around important access routes that have been compromised and around homes. There's no urgency to remove burned trees and plants unless they create a life-threatening hazard. Work with your neighbors. Look behind the property line. Just like fire, water and erosion does not respect property lines. And so in order to get a really good erosion control practice and strategy on the landscape, oftentimes we need to work beyond these fence lines, like in this picture, to have a complete project. Things shouldn't stop at the property line. So it's very important to work with neighbors. We also need to protect our property access. As I mentioned, all of our roads are, all of our road drainage facilities are undersized after fire. Emergency measures are high risk and provide a false sense of security. There is a place for them, but they're very site specific and they require a lot of maintenance. 3 is practices need maintenance and they need to be monitored throughout every storm event. Remembering that many practices that they're temporary in nature may need to be removed after the first winter and not just left on the landscape. Others will need to be maintained for several years to come. Doing nothing or less may be the best that you can do. At the end of the day, once again, consider nature as a best management practice. And then lastly, but not least, There's no silver bullet. When it's not safe, it's not safe. It's always prudent to have an emergency plan, an exit plan with more than one exit, an exit plan that also includes an on-foot exit, not just by a vehicle. So those are some things to think about. Anything that we do for erosion control and post-fire, even if it's, done according to licensed and certified specialists and experts, there's no 100% guarantee. In our steeper mountainous areas, there's always the likelihood of, a debris flow or a mudslide. So we need to be prepared, and we need to get out of our homes if they're still standing when it's not safe. So I was happy to be able to have a few minutes with everyone this morning. I hope this was useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. That was a lot of information. I know we are close up on our hour, but we're going to go ahead and do some questions. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. We'll go through ones that seem relevant for everybody. And I was hoping really quick to do a quick poll for everybody out there just to see where folks are, what communities they're calling in from before we start the Q&A. So I'm going to pop that up. It'll just take a minute. I'm going to launch a poll. I have some communities mostly that were in the fire affected areas. So if folks see that on their screen and you can just kind of check the community you're from, we'll see it going live. We have folks I know from all over. Down at the very bottom, if you're outside of there's some other options, but we'll let that go for a minute. And then I'm going to have some of the Q&As you will have seen that we answered during the presentation. I will go ahead and get Rich prepared, and we can even do it maybe while that poll is going on. We'll start with some questions, and again, it'll be recorded, and we'll follow up with some if we don't get to some. I'd like to go at least 10 minutes. So,
and Angie mentioned that you have a handout with my slideshow.
Oh yeah, I will. There'll be a handout that I'll send out to folks, and everyone whose email I have, and we'll also post it to the website that has some brief information. And then make sure, I know folks have wanted more detail on some specific things. Make sure to check out the other 3 presentations. Some of them will go into more detail, but I'm going to go ahead and just start with some questions that we have here, Rich, if that's okay.
Yes, fine.
And one of the questions is asking about water quality testing. And I don't know if we have the true answer to that. It says, is there any lab that provide free water testing for creek water from Laguna Creek? And I don't know if, I suspect there's 2 things, looking for if you have a diversion for your actual potable water. And that'll probably something that goes through that we can find the answer out and get back to you, but I don't know if you have any comments on that, Rich.
I don't. It's just not my area of expertise.
Okay. I'll see if I can find an answer to that and send it out to everyone. I have had that question several times. I'm probably going to check with environmental health at the county. Another question, people are asking about toxicity risk. I understand the risk near structures, but in the forest, anyway, away from structures, is there also a toxicity risk? Or are we just looking at standard, standard burns?
I don't believe there is, unless there's something that is hidden in the landscape. But generally speaking, if it's just ash and dust from soil, it's not hazardous. I mean, for people that have issues with asthma or hay fever or other allergies, that sort of thing, it's not a bad idea to be wearing at least a dust mask in these areas, particularly if it's a windy day. But definitely on home sites, saying that, if folks are putting in such things as straw wattles around a debris site, you might be worthy to pay the extra money and put a stormwater silt or a stormwater filter sock in, because it does filter out more pollutants than just a straw wattle.
Okay. And Rich, one of the other questions we got that I'll just put out there is if folks are using those to put around actual burnt debris flows from their homes and other things where there might be toxic, toxicity involved, we are checking and trying to get an answer on how would folks dispose of those. So that'll be a forthcoming question, and I hope to get that answer and I can put it out there to folks. So if you haven't been able to clean up your debris. So here's one that a lot of people are asking and we'll probably answer. Will Scotch broom come back with a vengeance? French broom, Scotch broom, how can we mitigate this? You alluded to it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to just reiterate that.
I know that the fire does compromise the Scotch broom seed, but it will come back. It does grow fast. It's a tap root. The fire happened after it set seed, so that we know that seed is there. If it was earlier in the season, it wouldn't have been as big of a problem, but of course there would have been more moisture in the plant then. I wish I could say it's gone, that this was the best thing that could have happened, but I don't think it's going to be any worse. It might be a little bit better depending on how hot the fire burned. If the fire burned around, like I said, structures, it's probably gone. It probably vaporized in the fire anywhere it burned really hot if you had the Scotch broom close to your home. But a lot of people just have it along the roadway on the way to their home and in the open landscape. And the open landscape doesn't burn anywhere near. I mean, a home can burn in excess of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, where the open landscape is going to be burning at a few hundred degrees, 500, 1,000 degrees. It just depends on how thick and dense and what it's made of. But when you get in around homes, you're talking thousands of degrees of heat, and nothing can survive that.
So Rich, there's another question, and I think some about the water quality impacts of ash. And I do have a handout on our post-recovery site. If you just go to the rcdsantacruz.org and hit post-recovery, there's actually a handout on water quality, and it talks specifically to ash. So if folks want to grab that, I don't have the answer. We probably will have more information on that in our stream talk that is the 22nd. So if you want to sign up for that. And in regards to native, I'm seeing so many questions about native plants and different plants and invasives coming back that we may actually add a talk from a plant specialist, some local plant specialists on that, because I think that's going to be really important.
It's a great subject because a fire gives us the opportunity to put something different and better back on the landscape. I developed with the Native Plant Society a booklet called the Fire Recovery Guide. It's on your website, I believe. It's on the NRCS website that's up on the screen. Very in depth. I co-authored the publication. I also wrote with the Native Plant Society a plant list for the Central Coast, Santa Cruz County, and the Bay Area, a plant of fire-resistant native plants that have erosion and slope stabilizing effects, and they're also drought tolerant and deer resistant.
Perfect. So the next question, I'm just going to go through a few more questions, hopefully that are covering some areas we haven't already touched on, and then we will do our best to answer all the questions. Some of them we might need to reach out to some other professionals. One of them that I think is important for right now is, how long can I wait for signs of seed bank recovery? And I will tell you that we were out in the field on
it's already regenerating
last week, and it's already happening. So
it's already happening. It happens almost immediately. Okay. I've seen it happen within a week of the fire being out on the areas where the fire burned cooler, and there was that resident seed bank there. But even in the picture that you see in the slide that's up on the screen, this is only a couple of weeks following the fire, the regeneration at the crown.
Okay. And then I have one that says, do you recommend it? I don't recall if you talked about this. Do you recommend staying off the land that burned, especially on a steep slope?
Yes.
For a certain period of time? And so I think, yes, the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, I said if that steep slope is adjacent to a house that didn't burn, but the property burned, and getting on that steep slope is to remove a hazardous tree, then there's no way around it. You're just going to have to do it, but just to tread as lightly as possible when you're removing just things that have to be removed because they still create a hazard.
Great. Another question, and we aren't experts in this, but somebody, and Rich, I know you had experience with this, so I heard you talk about it. It says, do you recommend the county for the debris removal? I don't know that they have that process in place, but one of the options for the actual toxic debris, meaning where your structures are burned, was to opt into the county's option, which will be, I believe, managed through the state, and that's an opt-in piece.
That's a FEMA.
Yeah,
It's through FEMA.
or can people pay for it themselves? So
They can
you
pay
had
for
some.
it. Wait
Yeah.
a second. Let me finish.
Okay.
They can pay for it themselves. They can also, some people have insurance and some have a limit on their insurance for debris removal. Some have zero. They don't have any, they have insurance, but they don't have any insurance for debris removal. So they need to check with their insurance company how much is covered. Now, saying that, I've seen where debris removal has cost in upwards of $100,000, and their insurance company says, we'll give you $20,000 for debris removal. Okay, you don't want to be in that situation, but FEMA will do it all, okay? The opt-in and the opt-out is that you have less control over what FEMA does on your site. Typically, FEMA takes everything, including maybe the upper foot of soil. You may just be left with a depression left in your landscape. They'll take out sidewalks and driveways and footings and retaining walls and your favorite tree that only has suffered some heat damage. Everything goes. So a lot of people kind of hold back, Some people will mark a few things and they said, can you save this? Some of that stuff sometimes can get saved, but most likely it's going to be all removed. They don't like hit and miss. They want to get in and out and do it as quickly as possible. If you insurance company, I know some insurance companies don't have any upper limit, whatever it costs. And people say, I want to do it over time because I still want to go through my site with a sieve. I want to go through it inch by inch. And once you make the decision with FEMA, they might say, I'm going to be out there next Friday, and it doesn't give people enough time to go through their debris. Other cases, they'll say, we're not going to get to you for 2 months. So it's all over the map, especially when this many houses have been affected.
Perfect. A lot of questions about hazard trees. We have a registered professional forester that will be speaking on Tuesday night. I highly recommend listening to that presentation, kind of how to tell if trees should be cut, should not be cut. In most cases, if it's a danger to your structure, they're probably going to recommend that. But he has a great presentation that will happen on Tuesday night. Let me see if I can find so many questions. Somebody's asking about our site visits. This isn't a question for you, Rich. If you go to the post-fire recovery portion of the RCD's website, that's rcdsantacruz.org, there's a big red button that says post-fire. There is a questionnaire there, an assessment questionnaire for folks to fill out. It's going to ask what kind of damage you have, etc., so that we can determine who we would want to send out to your site. We might do a conference call first to see, and then we'll prioritize those. So I know a lot of folks are asking about a site visit. So if you can go and fill out that questionnaire, rcdsantacruz.org, hit the post-fire button about halfway down the page, you'll see that questionnaire. If you have neighbors in the area, we are trying to coordinate visits so that we are visiting, 3 folks in the same area at the same time, or 10. Even if it's a whole day, so that we're not driving around to different locations and wasting a lot of time driving, because there are a lot of folks that want the service. Somebody asked, again, there's a lot of questions about native plants, acacia seeds. Those are certainly be in the ground. Broom, I think we will put on it. I'm going to try to find somebody to put in another, do another presentation just on plants.
It is an opportunity because these plants are going to be a lot smaller and more manageable to get rid of following fire. So even if they come back, they're actually going to be easier to get rid of than trying to get rid of massive, acacia trees and a thicket of, Scotch broom or whatever.
Right. And I think you already mentioned this. I just want to reiterate that there are ways to protect if people can't get to the debris removal, doing the core roll, the fiber rolls or other options to just put those around your debris fields, around cars. People forget
Right.
about burned cars or,
Do you have the straw wattle spec on the RCD website?
We're going to finish that this week. We have some specs on how to do that. You can put them in wrong. We are talking about, I'll ask folks this, we're talking about doing an actual how-to installation video with some local contractors. So we'll get that up. It sounds like a lot of people want that.
I think the Napa County RCD has a 6-minute video on the installation of straw wattles, a YouTube video.
Okay, we'll send that out. One last question. Rich, you might know, is fire retardant hazardous, especially if dropped near drinking water sources? And then we'll answer the rest of the questions. We'll put a question and answer page on our website. Go ahead.
I didn't understand the question.
It's fire retardant hazardous. So if they were dropping, and that got into the water, do you know that answer?
Well, possibly, it depends. If it's at phosphate, I understand that, if it runs off into streams or water bodies, it's one thing, and it's not, that toxic or hazardous. But if it ended up being directly poured into, say, a pond or other water source directly, then the concentration might be higher. But again, I'm not really the right person to give advice on that.
Okay, it looks like somebody just made a call. Chris, we just got a comment in here. Somebody that was working on the firefighting efforts said that they did not use any fire retardant for this fire. So I will confirm that.
Okay.
But we just got a comment about that from someone that works at the county. So hope we can confirm that and send that out. I think we probably should wrap it up. We are, over our time, but I appreciate so much everybody being here. Take a quick look at that poll. You can see that your neighbors are here. We have folks all the way up the North Coast, up in San Mateo County. And again, thank you so much. This will be recorded, and we will keep these questions that didn't get answered and follow up with them. We'll kind of group them together and hopefully put some get a new speaker to talk specifically about native plants and invasives, because that seemed like a really hot topic. But again, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our other workshops. And I'll send out a survey. I wrote that in the class, but we'll send out a survey, and you can recommend other topics you might want to hear and give us some recommendations. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining.
Great. And Rich, I'm going to have
Hope to see you soon for those of you that want a field visit.
Perfect.